Right. I'm here with my interlocutor from a new conversation today on our Patreon only episode. And this is a one of our episodes with past guests on the show and people I end up chatting with a lot on Twitter or Facebook. Um, do you as a European have any fucking anything in this stupid game about Elon Musk, one set of billionaires replacing the old Saudi-backed billionaires that used to own Twitter?
Hang on, I got a tweet. I saw a tweet from some Sean dude who was like really giving out about it. Some famous dude called Sean something. I don't know. It was absolutely crazy, and I was just like, why on earth are people giving a shit about it? Sean King
Oh yeah,
deletes his
Sean.
Twitter
The
after
people
calling
that
Musk a takeover
everybody's
of white power.
yeah.
White, oh yeah, it white power, whatever. Sure, this isn't an act of like white power. White power already existed and facilitated this. If you're going to talk about white power, like it's like the system itself. Fucking why delete Twitter? Delete everything. Yeah, delete your Windows, delete your Mac.
Right. I mean, here's the thing. Twitter has okay, so Facebook share has been falling for a while, and I am concerned about the business elements of the Elon Musk thing, and I'll talk about that for a little bit. But I'm not concerned. Like he's gonna be a free speech absolutist, and Twitter's gonna come back into what Twitter was in 2016. That wasn't the end of the fucking world, folks. And the reactionaries have not gone away. Have you not noticed?
Exactly. Yeah. One of
Um,
the one of the remarkable things about from the European perspective watching is the sort of hysteria over January 6th. Like that just looks like a picnic. I don't understand why there's like so much furor. But the idea that I don't know that this is somehow some sort of like political dynamic involved with January 6th and free speech in that way. The people who sort of wanted bank accounts to be seized and whatever about supporting or not the Canadian truckers, the same sort of punitive measures that some side of the left were calling for the state to intervene on. Just like it just seems shocking call.
yeah, I had our mutual friend one time, and I actually had a mild disagreement about that because I'm like, I think that's ridiculous to invoke those powers over that. Like, they're
What
not
could be?
really a they're not really a threat. And
Yeah, but also when there is a threat, and if it ever was to be a a threat that we all might support,
right.
then there's precedent for pushing down on the likes of us if we ever got mobilized.
Well, I mean, I've been telling people that too, and I've been like, look, like the FBI was entrapping and perhaps even inciting a bunch of semi-lumpenized Yahoo reactionaries in places like Michigan. But they didn't try very hard. They weren't very competent. But when they go after leftists, you don't hear about it, and you don't get off on entrapment. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that actually because I think it's a conspiracy. I'm saying that in many ways, the establishment, if it takes us seriously at all, and it usually doesn't, it takes us more seriously than rightist. Um,
Yeah, it's the ideas, isn't it? I would
right.
think. I mean, like as long as this remain ideas, it's fine. But if they're ever put into practice, I think
Yeah,
it's the
you can
left that
talk as
threaten the status quo, not the right.
you can. Yeah, exactly. Like the status quo, the right can be annoying, but and it's dangerous in some ways, and I think that's why you've seen more crackdown on it recently in a real way. But they didn't do it competently. They botched a lot of this, and you have to deal with the whole. Yes, the liberals talk about this a lot to an absurd degree, but they don't really take it seriously because they're not really pushing for like criminal prosecution of ringleaders outside of a specific few who really do seem to have been unhinged and dangerous. Like, but you're talking about like they arrested like 50 people. It looks like maybe like some of the Oath Keeper leadership and
Hmm.
are gonna go down. But that's like and on charges and a few people like Marjorie Taylor Greene may be disbarred from running again. Um, but it's really minor, even by our own historic standards. And this is what I've pointed out to people: like, we've had insurrections. We had an insurrection in the 50s where a bunch of Puerto Rican nationalists shot gunfire into the congressional chamber, and people don't even remember that it happened.
Nope. I've never heard of that.
Right? Yeah. Well, I kept on reading press release after press release, and educational thing after educational thing, saying that this hadn't happened since 1812 when the British burnt down the White House, and I'm like, that's not true.
Hmm.
Like, it's just not true. Yes, a bunch of people, yes, people died during January 6th, but most of them died from overexertion. Only one person was shot. Like, there do seem to have been some people who were out there who had like kill lists and stuff, but they didn't get to anyone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's no doubt that there's sort of serious players, serious, quasi-serious players
Serious
in
intending players. Let's
yeah,
say it that
and
way.
yeah, serious in the fact that they actually get together and hold guns
Right.
in groups of people. But in terms of that actually being some sort of serious event, yeah, it seems overstated.
It seems ludicrous to me too, and I've said it as much. I'm like, I've said, like, look, it's not that there is no danger there, but the idea that this was a very serious coup from the January Sixers is absurd. If you had a serious coup, it was actually 2 to 3 days before, when they were trying to do legal shenanigans to change US law. Like, that is a real coup, and that's not what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because it's a battle of it's the culture war, and
Right.
which brings it back to Twitter and Musk.
I mean, but the Twitter and Musk thing is funny to me. So I'll tell you what's fascinating to me about the Musk thing. Twitter, Musk spent like 44 something $billion on Twitter as an accusation, and intends to take it private. He's Most of that is debt leveraged, and most of that is debt leveraged with the collateral being, I think, stock value. But people have talked about, while he's the richest man in the world, most of his wealth is not liquid,
Hey, he sleeps on couches.
right? So we don't know what it's going to do. What I find interesting about this, and I pointed this out on Twitter, and I have some patriotic socialist friends who have adopted that moniker when they used to just call themselves fascists. But they figured they could pretend to be leftists for a little while. That I've known back from when I was a right winger. So I've known them for like 20 years. And they're all happy about the bonfire of the blue checks or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but there's a double irony here. The blue check shit, that's an obvious irony. Of course, it's been ridiculous, their hypocrisy about privatized speech and private censorship. And then the moment they're not in control of it, they freak out, right? Like,
Yeah.
and people like Greenwald, I don't love, but they're not wrong about that. We're also, Glenn, I'll give him credit for this. He doesn't know that Elon Musk by himself, even making the company private, will actually do much about that, because there will be legal, as other of these like conservative attempts, explicitly conservative attempts you just have done. There've been legal replications, and there's those sites end up being super censorious as well. So what ends up happening? Okay, so let's say we take Musk seriously, and let's say Musk is doing this like, Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. It's a political power and vanity project. It's not about money. You still have this thing where, like, the only people really financially benefiting from this is our vulture finance capital, like, and specifically banks doing risky loans to billionaires.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then maybe, like, because Trump is saying he doesn't even need Twitter to come back, and who knows, he might be right. Also, for all of Trump's talk and all of his fundraising, there's a lot of people who think we might not be seeing him again. We might be seeing like the next iteration of his successors. Um, so we have all that. That problem's interesting. But I was arguing with the MMTer actually about this because I was like, look, quantitative easing is a market operation. I agree with you about that. It doesn't directly inject cash into the stock
Yes.
market, but it does, and it is not. But I don't think quantitative easing is an MMT policy. But he was like, well, it can't cause inflation, and I'm like, I disagree with you, but not in the sense that you think. I don't think they're inflating the assets directly. What I think they're doing is these no interest loans are making investors feel weirdly safe. And
Mm.
there's so few traditional means of safe commodity investment because profit margins are so low. And I know MMTers hate when I talk about that. They don't believe me. Right? You're like, well,
Yeah.
they're making record profits right now. I'm like, they're making record profits off of what though? Rents?
Exactly.
Like, they're not making off of real commodities. So you have the fact that there's nothing for these people to invest in, so they invest in these tech things all the time, and so you have really risky venture capital money being over invested and people compounding the investment to keep a non-profitable business floating for like 9 years, a decade. And that's how both Bezos and Musk, the two richest people in the world, and Peter Thiel, if we add that to it too as well, uh, all got to where they're at,
Yeah.
even differently from like Microsoft and Apple. You know, the former richest people in the world. Okay, so you have that, and I pointed out like, okay, lately Meta stock's been in free fall. Twitter's never been profitable.
Mm.
Twitter hasn't been profitable for like a few months in the past decade, and the QE's over. I'm not saying that the QE was pumping assets, but I am saying that it had an effect to lead people to believe that the stock market was safe, whether or not
It
they
was taking
understood or
over.
not. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And so people were just continuously pumping money into it, and that's predictable. Right. And while you're telling me it's just a market operation, I will say to you, as a market operation to keep the banks afloat and the markets up, that's what they said they were doing it for.
Yeah.
So they knew the sentimental effect. And well, he's like, that's my MNT friend. He was like, that's just a sentimental effect. And I'm like, people in aggregate are predictable, and this is like why I'm a Marxist and not like a policy wonk. Like, this created conditions where people thought they could pump money into the stock market and be safe. That's ending. What's going to happen to these tech companies who all grew up, all of them, particularly the social media companies? Nobody made that profitable until after 2008. Has no one put that
Yeah, yeah,
together?
yeah. Yeah. I never sequenced that. That's pretty good.
Right. So I'm like, that's all over now. Like, the one thing we can say, even if they're not raising interest rates, they're not doing quantitative easing anymore. So
Like if you that in terms of commodities and in terms of actual like wealth generation, you've got the phone
yeah,
many iterations before what we've got now, and it's like in the same pattern of like the declining rate of profit, like the innovation being pumped into the phone year and year is declining also, and people need work, people need industry. That's what gives wind to the sails of any economy, and until that point happens, um, people are just sort of arranging finances to assert their sort of power over actual resources. Not that they're productive resources though. I think I don't know, did I mention it? I probably didn't mention it last time because we weren't talking on the topic, but what I remember studying economics and being taught like this corkscrew model, like sort of akin to like the flying geese model of
mm,
I mean, the flying geese was sort of developed in Southeast Asia, wasn't it? But like if you apply that to the entire globe, everyone's sort of, oh yeah, Africa's next. Africa's going to get the low wage, low capital economy, as soon as someone in the UK or the US comes up with another industry, but there is no other industry.
Right. And
I think
I
that's
mean,
what Zizek talks about, the biotech or whatever he's terrified of. Once something in that field becomes like marketable, like modified and diffused through the economy, you'll get another industry, but it's probably going to be a terrifying product. I think that's his deal. But like,
I get all you might not be familiar with the Italian American sci-fi writer Paolo Bagliupli, who did what would be called biopunk. But he writes about how basically biotechnology may become more viable as climate change comes on, for us to try to actually bioengineer our way out of
or
the
whatever.
problem.
Fuck. There you go.
And then you basically have you have not just a post-human, you have a post all current wildlife, because the bioengineered wildlife can outcompete it
That's
scenario.
fun.
And and
But it's but
I read those books when I'm like, well, you know what, as a Marxist, I'm not depressed enough.
yeah, I was just
So
gonna say I'm putting this book down.
like like
But
look,
it's gotta be like it can't just be a specialist industry. It's got to be like a generic or general industry that like gets everyone involved into it,
right.
and a global production chain, and
And
then the
that's a,
corkscrew happens again, pushes Asia up into the where we are, and we're up above,
well, the
and
thing is,
Africa gets involved.
Asia is kind of getting where we are anyway. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
here's
But this is the thing. There's been nothing since then. So Asia's just sort of like creeping up, and we're pumping credit and finance into our
right.
like system, because we're like fuck, come on. Like even the cheap credit for consumers, banks, whatever. I mean, that's sure that's some of what
The
the
whole
banks
thing is
do.
just trying to keep liquidity moving, because as long as liquidity is moving, people understandably and instinctually do not tell the difference between uh, artificial liquidity and actual economic growth. Um, because
Yeah.
in some ways there isn't a difference, but there does come a point to be where it is, where there is. And I always point this out to MMTers. Like, I agree with MMT's description of the imperial economies, and that they don't agree when I add that caveat. But I'm like, look, you can't do this unless you have high production capacity and you can command other people to buy your products. And they there's another part of one form of MMT, the Moser MMT, and my friend Sam Kangaroo promotes this, and this is the part of his stuff where he just loses me, where he's like, well, this is all about the government accepting price gouging because they're the primary buyer. I'm like, they're the primary buyer of labor in the United States, of semi-skilled labor. I won't say unskilled because that's insulting, but semi-skilled labor. Um, in any market, because they're such a large employer.
Mhm.
But they're not the primary buyer of material goods in general. That's ridiculous. Like, they're not buying milk in bulk for
Yeah,
the
they talk about
country.
services.
Yeah, no, he's talking about everything. So
Everything.
they think that the government basically buy what price it accepts. And I'm also like, even the United States can't tell OPEC what to do. Like,
For sure.
their theory is that sets the prices, and I'm like, no, I don't believe that. That's not all MMTers though. That's a specific form of them.
Right.
MMTers don't have a uniform theory of inflation. I actually agree with MMTers right now about what's driving the current inflation. It is not demand. It's a mixture of three things: class
Yeah.
war cycle.
Yeah.
Um, so wages are finally going up. Businesses are going to nominally accept that. They're going to try to recoup it by raising prices. But if you look at the percentage of profits going to workers, it's actually a smaller amount now than it was before COVID. Like, it's so all these wage increases are just nominal. Um,
For sure.
Two, and important, the supply chain stuff is a big deal.
Yeah.
That's actually probably the biggest driver of the initial inflation.
Initially, yeah,
Three,
yeah, for sure.
yeah, and three, as my friends at the Forex theory came up with, uh, after if anybody in the supply chain has a legit reason to raise prices, everybody in the supply chain has an excuse to raise prices,
Yeah.
and then there is a general excuse to raise prices. So cost push inflation becomes monopsony inflation. So basically, even though it's not quite monopsony powers, but basically like uh
Widespread.
it just becomes widespread because everybody tries to take advantage of the
Yeah.
situation to raise their profit rates temporarily, because even if their costs aren't going up now, they're afraid they're going to, and everything spirals.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so those three things are all happening at once. In Britain, I actually don't know about Ireland, but in Britain, where the inflation has been worse than in the U.S. or in the EU, uh, this is like more acute because of the specific weird awesome deal Britain got in the EU thing, where they could basically like out leverage the rest of the EU to get cheap labor, first from Ireland and then from Eastern Europe. And then they resented that because it was suppressing wages in the UK, like for real. In a way that's like different than immigration in the US. Immigration in the US only suppresses wages in very narrow fields. It does do a little bit, but immigration
It's a
in
huge market.
yeah, immigration in the UK was actually really what was keeping the disparity viable without massive inflation. And now the UK have all of the forms of inflation kind of like
Yeah.
out the ass.
Yeah, and the difficulties with sort of trade and reorient. I mean, there is an enormous reorientation of the economy in terms of both trade and production, or whatever they're trying to produce over here. I mean, there's a lot of it. It seems like a lot of it is started from scratch, like in terms of talks and negotiations, and also in incentivizing what sort of investment and growth industry is going to be coming up next.
So yeah,
Go on.
so when I think about that, so we always talk about why is the EU the only major capitalist power that doesn't have economic sovereignty? And it's literally a fluke of your own fucking laws. It's
The UK, you mean?
no, the EU. The
Why is
UK
the
has
EU? Say
economic.
it again. Yeah.
The UK has economic sovereignty. Well, the EU doesn't. Why doesn't it?
Sorry. Right. Yeah.
Right. It's not just that the individual polities don't. The EU as a whole doesn't either.
Mm.
But it's because you have the 3% rule. Like no country can do fiscal policy that would raise inflation more than 3%. So you've effectively put a hard cap on your inflation by a rule in the fucking constitution of the EU. So you have.
I want to go back.
And it's impossible to remove, right? And it's not impossible to remove because you couldn't remove it. It's not a legal impossibility. It's the European Parliament's a joke, and the representatives of the nations have no reason because they don't trust each other to remove it. So they all use it because it basically benefits Germany and France. Like
yeah.
So that's why the EU doesn't have economic sovereignty. But all that said, you still benefit from the privileged relations with the United States as a trade partner, and you have good relations with the other major powers except for Russia.
You talking about EU or UK?
Yeah, to talk about the EU, the UK too here, but because
we didn't get any of that American gas that the EU got. As far as I know,
that's true. But one thing I was going to talk about, like one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about in regards to this is, like, let's say the EU was gone, could Ireland do an MMT policy? And my answer is no. And I know this is unpopular, but you can't command prices on the international market. Ireland cannot. Britain probably can't, honestly, without a special relationship to the United States. We can. Why? We produce the second most amount of shit, even though it doesn't seem like it, but we still do. And we have the biggest fucking guns. Like, it's really that simple. Like, China can do it, even though it doesn't. right yet because China doesn't want to subject its currency to the international market too quickly. Um, but China can do it if it wanted to because it has the second largest amount of guns and uh, has the most productive capacity. The EU as a whole could, but individual nations within the EU, I know some MMTers think they can. I don't believe it. Like I'm just like you're gonna tell me
Oh,
Scotland's gonna be able to command prices from like
I would imagine like I don't know, an enormous sort of amount of pain and turnaround to orient smaller countries to be able to, they've got to fucking start producing something like
right,
that the world needs to be able
and
to do
they
that shit.
and they have to do it with their own resources.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, a
Which
lot of
yeah,
pain. That's what I mean.
yeah, good fucking luck if you're Scotland
Exactly.
or Greece.
Yeah.
Like there's no way large nations are going to dominate that game. Imperial power is going to dominate that game. And so my friends over at Strange Matters magazine, who are like post MMT or some of them are Marxist, have been talking about like we just need to be honest and talk about currency and like how the MMTers made a lot of innovations um, into thinking about currency that really kind of began uh, with Marx in some ways. Now, Marx is actually in Capital. He holds on to the old story of currency creation as commodity money. In Grundessa, he kind of plays around with other forms of money other than commodity and credit money, but he just doesn't really see them as viable yet. And my answer is they weren't yet. The states weren't
Mm,
powerful enough to do that. There was not an imperial circuit. Marx was wrong about the origins of money, but completely right about how that was functioning at his time.
mhm.
Um, what we are talking about is post 1920s, post and I actually my thesis that I haven't told to the world yet, so you're gonna get it first,
Here we go,
is
guys.
MMT conditions are part of a response to what would have been a final crisis of capitalism in the 1920s.
Huh.
That that the reason why I don't believe in final crisis theory is not because you don't hit terminal profitability. It's that so far capital has been far more innovative than we have historically thought on its ability to incorporate elements of the state or this, that, and the other in adjusting temporarily to a crisis. But the thing is, the crisis modes eventually come back. So
Yeah.
you basically can buy yourself time. And that was what I've always told. I've told him in tears this for years. Like your policies would work for a little while, but unless we had a closed world market, right? Which, by the way, you're not under capitalist conditions anymore. We might as well run the fucking revolution. And if I run the
Yeah,
revolution, I'm
yeah.
going to go further than MMT.
Absolutely.
Um, so, so like, but unless you have a closed world market that's run not democratically, it would have to be run by policy planners. You can't do this. Like, it will eventually hit a hard block because these individual nations have limits of what they can possibly produce. I mean, I guess theoretically, even in the world government one, there would be a limit, and that would be like human productive capacity of the
Hmm.
planet. But that's a lot. So
So bring it back to the point about 1920s.
oh, the
Uh,
1920. Well, the 1920s is when you start seeing the getting off of commodity or commodity backed money, and not relying on commodity and credit money for the creation of money.
so, as in, at this point, this is where their policies could be
Could
operable.
be
Yeah, yeah,
audible at my scale. Now, I actually think the MMTers were that neo-chartalists, not chartalists, neo-chartalists were right that credit and debt relations actually are the source of currency, not commodity. Commodity is a source of value, and the reason why there's a difference between like a Marxist like me who's willing to make some concessions to MMTers is I still believe in labor theory of value, and they don't.
yeah,
And so what I say to them, yeah, you're completely right about currency, but currency is not actually what I'm talking about when I talk
yeah.
about even profits. Like that's nominal profits. When I deal with profits, I'm dealing with the wealth that it can command. Like so
Does that raises the question about like trying to pin down socially necessary? Does it?
yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It also is like I was talking to Clive Burrow yesterday about the lumpen, and he brought up some letters I didn't even know about from Marx and Engels, and I read a lot of Marx and Engels. I thought I read most of the letters, but about when they started
Happy
nuancing.
birthday.
Yeah, there's always a fucking new letter somewhere. And unfortunately, since they didn't publish that much formally during their lifetimes, to actually understand a lot of Marx and Engels, you gotta dig into the
Really?
letters, and then you're like, well, no one fucking understood what they were talking about. No wonder Marxism's been weird for years. Um, but what you see is a discussion about the lumpenization of the so in late Marx and Engels, there's two lumpen proletariat. There's the lumpen properly speaking. Those are people who are permanently outside of any productive or socially necessary labor. They are parasitic on social production, not because they all want to be. They're not. Some choose there, and they come from all different class backgrounds. So the other hybrid classes are like subclasses within classes: the petite
Mm.
bourgeoisie, the labor aristocracy, etc. The lumpen aren't a class. They're something that kind of happens as a byproduct of transitions in capital. Um, but one thing that I never thought about is that okay? Marx doesn't define working class. Famously, the Capital Volume 3 ends like literally at the point he's about to write down the definition. Um,
Oh God.
we have kind of a working definition from inference that it's people who don't have productive capital and are wage earners. Um, with maybe the caveat that they need to be in productive parts of the circuit of capital, but that doesn't necessarily mean direct commodity production. So, like
Hmm.
people in logistics or whatever
Yeah.
are raw materials are still part of that. Well, then you take the socially necessary category, which is important in Das Kapital, but not explained that much, and then the productive and unproductive category. Now, remember that productive, though, in series of surplus value, does not mean socially productive. It means productive to capital.
Of course.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Surplus value. Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
so socially necessary. So you have things that are unproductive but socially necessary. Teachers, uh, facilitators. Marx might even say managers.
Logistics.
Logistics. Yeah, you have things that are socially unnecessary but productive. Drug dealers. Um, you know, uh, luxury good peddlers. App makers maybe. That's a question because that might be rentier relations now, but still.
Mm.
um then you have a couple of truly parasitic classes: the lumpen, the lumpen properly speaking, and then finance capital. Most of Marx defines, like most classical economists, even like the American founding fathers, for example, hated finance capital. They
Yeah.
hated it.
Yeah.
um uh
Rackets.
so yeah, so what Engels starts writing about in the 1880s is all these temporary service sector workers and like pensioners and people who were in the reserve army of labor a lot, but are enough of the proletariat that even though they're not productive or they're not directly productive, they do stuff that helps. It's either socially necessary or helps the circuit of capital sometimes, but their wages and portions are so low
Mm.
that they have to live amongst the true lumpen and that they can get caught up in that very easily. Well, Clive Burrow argues that the whole precariat thing that we're seeing is actually just the final expansion of lumpen to most of the post-industrial working class.
Like, the just pure rejection.
Well, no, he says he's talking about the second category that Engels and Marx mentioned in the late period.
The second.
So
Yeah.
they call this the honest and working lumpen. I might call it the
Okay.
precariat because it's just, um. But what I think is interesting about that, all right, MMT relations hides that. Why does it hide that? Because these rentier relations and this stuff stabilizes uh, a lot of these gig work things, these logistic workers, these service workers, etc., that are not in industrial labor, because increasingly uh, socially necessary labor time for producing commodities will never reach zero, but technology can make it get damn close.
Yeah.
So now you have an issue. You have socially necessary labor time being reduced by technology, so the industrial proletariat's portion of the proletariat shrinking. And unfortunately, Bernstein was right. It was never more than 40%. The larger proletariat is in these, because of the expansion of the welfare state, was actually kind of incorporated into the proletariat. This is actually what Rosa Luxemburg supported welfare state was actually based on. This was de-lumpenizing these people in this hybrid position. So, and then you had the Panthers who argued that, look, what happened to the black classes outside of the Northeast who weren't allowed to industrialize is going to happen to everybody, and they were right.
I think this is in our last chat. This is what I was talking about as a
Mhm.
sort of like an internal colonization, or a sort of
Right.
a harvesting of the sort of the depository of capital in after in the Marshall Plan. Basically, this wealth was distributed for various reasons, and now it's sort of it's ripe.
Well, I've always talked about, Maoist third worldists are wrong about everything now, but ironically, they describe the world of the 1950s, except that it wasn't to buy the industrial proletariat off.
Hmm.
It was to, that wasn't how they were thinking. It was to stabilize these capitalist societies, which effectively does buy the industrial proletariat off temporarily.
Yeah.
But it wasn't
Various
like
reasons.
their way of explaining it's like a conspiracy theory. It's like no, you
A
even see this
really clever
happening.
plan.
Yeah, you actually see this happening in China now, and it's not because like I don't believe the CPC is trying to like you know deindustrialize and weaken its proletariat. I don't think even the most bourgeois elements of that party are that evil. What I think is like this is the way capital develops.
Yeah.
Once you hit the terminal commodity crisis, um, but we're still in capital. Like this is like sometimes
Yeah.
I float that maybe we're not, but I still ultimately think we're still in capital because the MCM circuit still seems to be at play. And the reason why I say that, and this goes back to the MMT and some of your unclarity on it. Well, I think the MMT is right about sovereign currency. They're wrong that any nation can do this. They're just wrong. And the reason why that's important is, um, like I know, like Fahoud, um, over there at the Center for like Sustainable Global Prosperity will say like, well, Egypt could do this, but I lived in Egypt when they floated their currency off of the. It was a fucking nightmare. Like it, like my apartment, which I think was like 500 Egyptian pounds a month, which is not a lot, for a 3-bedroom apartment. I mean, now it's not, it's not even, it is developing world conditions, but still. Um, but my apartment by the end of that was costing me like the equivalent of 150 USD. Like it had inflated, like inflation had been that bad. And it was also so bad that like
How much did it start at?
500.
Oh, it was pegged. Holy shit!
No, it wasn't pegged. It wasn't pegged in dollars. I mean, like my pay was pegged in dollars, but
Right.
I got paid 50% in pounds. To get a lot of my money out, I'm not gonna lie, I took it out in gold
Wow.
because also I couldn't exchange Egyptian pounds. They were effectively worthless outside of Egypt for several years. So like I could exchange it in Egypt or I
Mm-mm.
could buy gold and then sell that for dollars, which is
Jesus.
what I did. Um,
So I think is what. Sorry, my earphones are talking to me. Anyway, thank you for that. Is the thing the sort of the dynamic, I guess, that the MMTers are trying to engage um, austerity, basically, and this sort of suppressing, regardless of the nominal wage increases, but the obviously the inflation
I
is
don't. I think we have to separate their political project, and I do think there's a descriptive side of this, and the descriptive side of this is who does MMT better in the United States? The Republicans. They do. They do. The Democrats always try to balance the budget. They always cut the money supply and doing that while trying to keep all their programs running. When they do that, we start seeing dips in demand because there's less money to be had. You start seeing asset inflation from credit. So we already have too much credit, but then it jumps up, and we're seeing that right now because people become even more highly debt leveraged, and eventually they can't service their debts, and then you have defaults and then massive
Yeah.
shrinkage. Republicans don't do that. They don't give a shit. They talk about the budget all the time, right? They talk about it all the
Yeah.
time, but they don't ever actually do a goddamn thing about it because they actually understand what it would do.
Yeah, exactly. Fair point.
So, so,
Well,
so what?
what I was thinking in terms of sort of historic global economy there was that sort of a rational, cold, pure capitalism at the moment would be deflating the hell out of European and American workforces in terms of its value. Like there's an equalization that needs to happen. If in that corkscrew schema that I was talking about, where the West is, in inverted commas, is not leading the way in terms of the next sort of tier of industry, and Asia's sort of pushing up, knocking on the door. What's sort of what the crisis starting in 2008 is is that sort of equalization. And but it's sort of the dynamo spun a little bit with quantitative easing, with cheap credit, but because that's all coming to an end, it's just like we can't keep sort of gassing the economy over here with that anymore. This equalization has to happen. These consumers have to start paying the same amount as some of the rest of the world for their consumption, because they're not making anything.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was the thing that I was thinking. Like, so is there a sort of a political, or what's MMT's relation in terms of that narrative, I guess?
So MMT says that the limits of an economy actually is its overall productive capacity plus its wealth. All right. And I say, yeah, and if you take that seriously, that means that imperial powers will always have an ability to do it in a way that small countries cannot, even though you say the otherwise. And so you have to deal with the fact that your politics is actually dependent on an imperial status quo. It is.
Yeah, and
Like,
that's pretty much what you described with the 1920 point.
right. And that's also why, for example, this real productive stuff is more explanatory than policy choices for like the 50s. So you look at the 50s. Why can the US do this? Well, it has half of the world's real wealth. It uses that real wealth to get rid of its overproduction by building up Europe, and it then uses that to build up repressive forces to get raw materials from Latin America and people in this traditional sphere. That's what it does, right?
Mm-hmm.
MMT doesn't deal with that at all. It just doesn't
Yeah,
look at that. It is not factored into its picture whatsoever. And when they talk about it as discrete policy choices within a nation.
yeah,
And I just think like that.
as if it could be applied to any nation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
it cannot. It
yeah,
absolutely cannot. And I've actually pointed this out with like people like, well, China's going to be the new world hegemon. I'm like, China's going to be the major world power, or at least the co-world power with the United States in the immediate future, until all the nation states fall apart from climate change and we're all doomed. But so we're dealing with biotechnology and the other hell world we started talking about at the beginning of this
oh,
show.
Jesus,
Uh,
shoving all of the elephants out of the room.
but all that said, it will not be and does not want to try to do what the US did, because China, I think, knows it can't. It cannot do it because they're trying to benefit off of a world war of that destructive capacity that they are also nuclear arms holders in, means that way of getting rid of the world's capital, like the US didn't set out to do that. It was an accident. Like they just happened to be the major productive power that only had a tiny island bombed once. Like,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
all
yeah.
of its productive capacity was fine, wasn't destroyed. That also led the US policymakers to believe stupid shit like war was productive to wealth. I guess because we don't ever lose things.
So is there also then a disconnect in the idea that because Europe was flattened, that all this that the declining rate of profit would have hit a wall or was hitting a wall, and because basically like almost like Europe being flattened is like almost like a dam being
Yeah,
dismantled,
I
and just
actually,
this,
yeah, I
what is
think
MMT failing to make that connect?
MMT's sole focus on currency and the reality of currency and the reality of
Yeah, I gotta
accounting
get this in my head.
it doesn't, like, I always say this when I fight with MMTers. Like, I think you're right about currency.
Yeah.
Currency is a tiny part of the real economy, even in your equation, but it's the only thing you focus on. And because currency is controlled by nation states, and because debt relations and all that are part of coercive governments, are religious institutions, if you go back before there's formal governments, like, it leads you to believing that national policy can set this as political will.
Yes.
Motherfucker, I wish that was true, but it's not. Or the USSR would not have been in deep shit in the 70s. Like,
Okay.
like there's these things are not just about policy. Policy can make it better or worse for a particular nation state. Like, the US could, for example, probably have a much more generous welfare project without really risking anything, except that the reason why, and some MMTers agree with me on this, the reason why that doesn't happen is it would weaken, they don't say the bourgeois workers because they avoid, some of them even avoid pretending that classes are real. But
What you're about to
they,
say is a given.
yeah, the reason why that isn't, they're right, is a political choice to keep workers' power relatively low. They're right about that. What they're wrong about is that's the only reason it's happening.
Okay.
Because the other thing this thing does is, if you have highly debt leveraged areas, you have, and people's real wealth is highly debt leveraged. I mean, homes, etc. All this speculation. It does serve a purpose of de-radicalizing the proletariat, but there's other things that do that too. And it does lead to some very problematic cul-de-sacs. And so the MMT answer is like, okay, but we know the government could do full employment and we get it done. Well, the Marxist answer to that goes all the way back to the Salians, is like, they will never do that. Ever, because it would effectively destroy capitalist power and eventually would be unprofitable. You'd hit something like the 70s. And you'd have something like stagflation, because nominal currency value and real value would become totally decoupled. Like, that happens in either a deflationary or an inflationary crisis. That's what's going on. And so, what this thing does, what this thing can do, and I don't want to make it sound like it's just hiding something artificially. Like, the liquidity can stimulate production temporarily. And not just consumer production, because I don't think people understand how small a part of the economy consumer goods actually are. But it can stimulate industrial production.
Yeah.
So, temporarily, but it won't last forever, because if it lasts too long, you get the value liquidity. I mean, you get the currency value versus real value decoupling, and that's what causes inflation and deflation. And that's a very abstract way of saying that. Now, Marxists don't have a good theory of why inflation happens. We don't. Part of that, I think, one. Yeah, we don't really need. We're not really that concerned about it. Like, we think it affects things, and the scholar Colin Drum, who I kind of know personally, has talked to me about how Marx lived in a 100-year period of remarkable currency stability, historically. And I think that's part of it, because it wasn't coming up. But that also meant that like profitability crises in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s were immediately apparent to everybody.
Yeah.
But they're not immediately apparent in the 20th century because of the disconnect between like currency value, its fluctuation, real prices, like all this stuff. So when people talk about record profits, I'm
Intensely
like,
complex.
yeah, are you talking about record profits and wealth? Are you talking about record profits, and are you talking about nominal profits? Like those aren't really the same thing.
Yeah.
And when people tell me we're in a time of like record profits, I'm like, well, one, rents are always 100% profit
Yeah.
once you pay off cost. So there's not like, and the reason why rents are rents is because they require coercion to engage in. People do not engage in rents unless they're made to.
Well, this is the sort of the principle I was trying to figure out the last time we talked was in without sort of knowing a whole heap about it. It looked like in a time of increasing profits from rents and sort of decrease from production.
Mm-hmm.
Is this capitalism anymore? Whereas, and this is why I sort of laid the importance at Lenin at its value in describing the situation, just for the simple fact that, oh no, in imperial capitalism, as capitalism is decaying, this financial situation occurs, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was talking about with somebody the other day. I was actually talking to my friend JG Michael at Parallax Huge last night, and he was asking me about my opinions on this, and I'm like, look, like what I'm describing sounds like the neo-feudalism thesis, except that it is still totally dependent on capitalist production, because
Yeah.
we're not like the way in which we're not feudalist is we're not producing material goods and food for a lord.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we're not,
It
with the
might
most we're
happen,
right, yeah,
but
but we're
we're
not
many
is
steps from that. Yeah.
right. And feudalism, uh feudalism is actually an interesting thing, because I point out that like I am sort of convinced by the feudalism is not one thing thesis, because there's so many different relations. But what is consistent to it across the board is there is a collapse of the distinction between, well, actually, let me rephrase that. The fact that there is very little distinction between the political and economic is immediately obvious in feudalism, and that rents of various sources, be they taxes, land subsidies, payments in kind, monetary things, whatever. Like there's many ways this happens, but rents and servitude to lords to collect those rents, our servitude to a manor or an estate or a private company, or whatever, is involved. All right.
Yeah.
Now, and the reason why I say a private company, like I have argued that like U.S. mining in the 19th and early 20th century was more feudal than capitalist, because
Because
they
camps, right?
yeah, they were bonded to camps. They had internal economies. They weren't really free labor. They couldn't just leave. Um, that and in fact, actually, when they were unionizing and they would argue with European unionists, they would actually say like, European miners are proletarianized. We aren't even that yet. Like that was from their mouths. Like the regular
No.
workers were saying that. They understood that. So like they
Could you
like
imagine?
like they didn't call it like, oh, we're in a feudal. They weren't that sophisticated, but they understood that they were hearing what proletariat had. Like we're not free labor.
Mm.
Like they got that. So, and sharecropping I would consider as analogous to feudalism. But
See, I mean, considering the sort of technology, I would imagine that it's going to be like sort of we get to. I mean, we get even closer to zero growth economy than we already are. All the
well, that's the thing about
superfluous
feudal economy. Feudal and manorial economies are
immediate
usually,
consumption.
yeah, they're usually subsistence consumption societies. Even, I mean, that's why like even the wealthy aren't that wealthy, even though it seems like there's world of
Yeah.
differences. You're like, You
I
know,
mean, it's their direct command over the geographic resources, isn't it?
right?
And
And the fact that
they're not hoarding as such.
it's maintained by explicit, like class is explicit and it's enforced. It is not implicit and enforced. It's explicit and enforced. It's a matter of legal and social bonds, etc.
Sure.
What we're moving into is a rentier economy that looks a lot like that, but is still based on the productive capacity of capital, um, and would have a limit to it. But I think that's why MMT feels so prescient right now, is because so many people have so little real wealth that
Hmm. Uh,
these tokens of currency feel more important.
yeah.
And because the average American's only source of real wealth at all is maybe a pension fund and the home they own, if they own one.
So it's interpreting these huge CEO profits as something more significant than just a little less actual significance in terms of commanding just actual material wealth, not nominal or currency. Does that make sense? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like oh, he's now this like insane billion coming out of his ass, but actually what's actually happening is you're getting poor as fuck and he's just controlling more things.
Yeah, he control and that's and I think if you start looking at the nature of the super rich right now, who are all nouveau riche, we should also notice that. Is that all of them are highly dependent on tech, they're highly dependent on rent, and they're highly dependent on things that had government support.
Yeah.
Like which is
This is I was gonna
always true
say
for capitalists, but it's
oh my god.
more true for them than most capitalists. Like it's so
But that but
like
that's a part of this sort of taking over, and like what you were saying about sort of any sort of stimulus package under current sort of policy parameters. I was kind of laughing and mostly crying watching reading a call for consultation over here from the Department for Transport, and they're looking to level up and gain net zero and build back better. These are the
mm,
priorities, and so the document sets out these pillars. And it's like, okay, wow, here, look, this is the money that Johnson's talking about. He's going to fucking actually he's going to fucking build something here and he's going to help people. And it's just like, please tell us what skills we're going to need, how we're going to get the skills, and how we're going to market recruitment. It's just like, what? And that's that bit of money being flushed through to stimulate industry, like you were saying. But like in 10, 20 years, the people that are going to get at those jobs, which they'll have a nice wage for a moment and they'll have a shiny badge. But like in 10 years' time, their skills will be endemic. Everything that will be surrounding this policy will have collapsed and they'll be in these dead end jobs and earning fucking crumbs.
yeah,
And it's
which by the way I've been pointing out for years. Like this is explicit. The explicit push for like STEM investment in education and policies has been, if you actually look at STEM jobs, the only place in STEM where there's a systemic real shortage is coding. um Coding is tedious, not everyone can do it. um Everyone can do probably a little bit of it, but
mhm,
like to be really really proficient at it, not everyone can do it. um
do it
and
really
because of
slowly.
that, it has a high burnout, uh even though it's high pay. And the skills change dramatically very quickly. Um, and I mean, this is where like I totally get why like there's so much resentment in the U.S. about Democrats and about probably in the UK and Britain about New Labor, is because their answer is go to school, learn the code. And I'm like, one, if they all do that, it's going
Yeah,
to collapse.
that's in the
Two,
document. In the document, it says it's like we've got to get this medium to low skill labor up to medium high, and it's like who the fuck, to service the machines? How are they all going to cram in around this machine and fix this machine? What are you talking about? That tier stays. They're always going to be there. It doesn't matter if they skill; it's relative.
right? It's like all you're doing. Well, what they used to say about that in America, and they were slightly more honest about it. Um,
Compete, motherfucker.
is that you would outsource all the low skilled labor to other countries. But that's not true anymore. You can't do
No, no.
that. Like we've reached that you're reaching a point where like the cost of building something
What are you
in
talking about? Hang
China,
on a second. We all we have to do is like sail to Rwanda and just like
right?
container people, man. We're fine.
I guess that's what. But people have been amazed that that's not happening, and I'm like, look, China gives pretty fair deals to Africa. I actually will. I've gone out on a limb in saying that. They're weird though about it. They're abnormally untransparent, even for capitalists. you know, um, and it leads to a lot of paranoia in Africa and a lot of resentment of the Chinese. But the other thing that leads to resentment of the Chinese is your thing about the corkscrew applies here. So this is something actually I hadn't thought about this directly. I've kind of puzzled over it for a while. There is no new industry in which we already haven't got all the most of the technical advances between the West and China pretty much worked out, and we've hit kind of plateaus.
Yep.
So they come in with the skills. They come in. They have such a skills gap in labor. They bring their own workers. They might train. They might train local people and hire local people for very basic stuff. And when I lived in Egypt, they did. But but so Africa's getting infrastructure, which it desperately needs. It's getting access to goods, cheap consumer goods from China, which it kind of needs. But it's not getting a lot of jobs,
Yeah.
and
It's
it's
like
not getting its
prep
own industry.
prep for the theory.
Right.
And it's not going to happen until, well, I guess, I mean, because China's sort of racing ahead, it's likely that the new Silicon Valley, and that's the thing with STEM, like generations are being sacrificed in education over here for STEM. I think the strategy being it will produce a single Steve Jobs at some stage, and an industry will flare up, and the corkscrew can start moving again. All the kids going through it at the moment, I, I don't know.
Maybe sometimes I point out low hanging fruit doesn't last forever. I'm not a Malthusian, but I also believe in entropy, motherfuckers.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you can't do that forever.
Yeah.
And we
Well, I
and
mean, but that's what I was describing earlier. That like, well, our conditions, our worsening conditions is, well, I mean, is A, either just that we're equalizing, or B, that we're actually going where it will be the cheap labor source
so
from Asia.
if you look at well, here's the thing: Asia's hitting real other limits. Um,
It was a
we talked about this
hypothetical
off
for sure.
air. The Asia has food problems, all of it.
Mm.
The population ratios to arable land is low. And while I'll defend the Cultural Revolution's productive capacity, but I also point out yeah, but China's population was a lot lower back then, and China also has a demographic crisis coming, just like the West. And while Beijing's probably going to be fairly fine from climate change, Shanghai's fucked, and it's
Yeah.
not going to have this weird America moment that accelerated us. It's not going to have economies like the periphery of East Asia, which were able to, for a variety of reasons, get hooked into that imperial economy. In Japan, it was a pacification strategy. In the case of Korea, we tried to screw the Koreans over many times, actually. And here I mean South Korea.
Yeah.
But they actually took our own logistics and used it in Bangladesh and did the same thing we did to them. And so you have the miracle in the Han River, etc. But there's real limits to that, and like you see that now, and like the current Korean president's like talking about upping the work week to like 76 hours a week. Like I lived in Korea. Most people don't realize this. South Korea has a very high work week, a very low minimum wage, and very low productivity expectations. I'm actually serious about this. They basically have roughly the same overall output as a Western country, but if you look at productivity per hour, it's quite low. And part of that is like their strategy for handling social order problems is just to keep people working all the fucking time. So
Fuck.
so very low minimum wage, Now, like I point out to other people, you don't actually need a minimum wage if you have good unions, like
Yeah, yeah.
Scandinavia. Like you don't need a minimum, but very low minimum wage. Um, uh, a fairly equal society compared to the West. Actually, Gini coefficient in South Korea is actually not super high. Um, uh, I think it's even better in China's, or at least it was better in China's. So China's has gotten a lot better in the last 5 years. Um, but what you also have there is a cracking of the labor movement. You have the same kind of conditions that actually you see in the West, and it's tied into the West because their ability to do this is based off of getting around our tariff rules by producing stuff in Bangladesh, and also dumping their overproduction into the United States, in particular, and Europe as a secondary market, and some into China actually, uh, so that they can build up their own capacity. And it's worked for a long time, but it's been slowing for a decade. And as you see, this politics in South Korea look a lot more like politics in the United States and Europe. Um, and what I've been pointing out to people is I'm like, with the exception of Canada, um, you basically have the French election forever. And what I mean by that, I mean like right now there's a resurgent social left, right? But we have no real power. We might feel like we have
Yeah, yeah,
power,
yeah.
but every major decision is a battle between different kinds of rightist.
Yep. Oh, for
Um,
certain.
and occasionally American leftists and liberal, well, soft leftists, not hard leftists. I don't know a hard leftist is stupid, but like, somebody who might call themselves a democratic socialist but is in the Democratic Party will get confused and think like Macron or Merkel or whoever is like a liberal in the sense that it means in America.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they're fundamentally misunderstanding European politics. And they also think that means that Europe is far more left wing than the
Yeah,
United States,
yeah.
which
I've
is
heard this.
bullshit. It's just bullshit. Like yes, there are more political opinions expressed, but the actual ruling ideology, even when one of those left policies come to power, see the Mitterrand government, is effectively the same as in the United States. Like
The
you, with the
the
exception of
post-war the
yeah,
post-war development, the debates on the formation of the European community and stuff are fascinating. Like there was one dude who Mussolini um had arrested, and once he got out he was a big name, but he was a federalist, and that was one huge camp in the development of the European community. And you read the arguments as they go on, year by year over the decades, and it just gets narrower and narrower until the neolibs are the sort of predominant voice, and this federalist idea is like this single opposition, this social
mhm.
opposition to the economy and to the markets. And just but through the 80s they just got hammered, and by 1992 it's gone. It's the EU's an incredibly right wing situation, and that's because of the governments of Germany and France and the UK.
Yeah, and so I add to this in my understanding of this, and you may or may not agree with me, but so what I've been telling to everybody is outside of right now, outside of maybe China, because China's politics is more opaque to me. Xi, from what I've talked to more and more Chinese people over the past few months before my show and in private, and I've gotten a much more nuanced view of Xi. And Xi's interesting to me because Deng Xiaopingists love him, but anti-Deng Xiaopingists also love him, and that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I think we might
He
be
does have that smirk. I mean,
right.
he looks like he knows what he's doing.
And for the most part, China has been the most responsible party. They can navigate international capital better because they can keep their capitalists in line, but they always need foreign investment, and there is a hard limit on what they can do. And I say that because I point out like Xi, like big this the big reforms of the Red New Deal are basically rural infrastructure development, um, returning free rural public schools, and slightly kind of sort of beginning to a little bit socialized healthcare because because after the Deng reforms, healthcare in China actually looks a lot like healthcare in the United States, except
I
that
hear that.
doctors are paid shit. So like, so
Communism.
and there's some other stuff in there, but she's also got to keep these conservative elements in his coalition, despite the fact that there's not supposed to be any such thing,
It's
because you
still
see these,
politics.
you have this anti-gay stuff that's gone through. You have a bunch of people who have really gotten into this Confucian plus communism equals true, which to me is like wild. When I'm like, what the fuck was the Cultural Revolution for if you're doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
I
sounds
thought
like
you
a
were trying to
cult.
stomp that out. Like, well, but Xi is a
That's
legit.
is that the same? Is that the same mentality as the sort of right populism in over here? Is that just we're sick of the status quo and we just
I
want
think.
something weird to
Well,
change?
the way Dong Ping Han has said it, and I also got this a little bit off of Kaiser Gua over there at Seneca Podcast, and he's a liberal. Is that the like you can even look at stuff like the life expectancy, even during the Great Leap Forward, the life expectancy in China was raising really quickly. Like, despite the famines and stuff in the Great Leap Forward, the average age went up to like 50 something from like 35, or it was really low. Now, some of that was war, admittedly causing it to be that low, but still. And then you
Opium
see all these raises until 79. You see a lot of raises, and where you see it at, if you actually look at the fine details in the countryside. So the Cultural Revolution kind of doesn't go as well in the city. Also, Mao really, really allowed like local autonomy and democratic practices within communist like co-ops and communes in the countryside, and he's
maybe.
kind of started to allow it in the cities, and the second Shanghai Commune happened, and then he suppressed it in the cities. Um, but when Deng got rid of the worker, they had a labor token system that actually kind of worked. Now it still had currency involved, so it wasn't a perfect labor token system, but
Wow.
so doctors and the reason why doctors and nurses were provided for free in the rural China, and the barefoot doctor system, even if it pushed a little bit of snake oil, actually worked. Like it produced tons of results. Was based off the labor point system. So you got less every hour you did as a teacher or a doctor. If you were trained, you didn't have to do that much hour, and if you contributed more to the general pot, you get like more currency for open market spending at the end of the year and something else. Deng ended all that, and what you saw was a arresting of the speed of uh, of life expectancy. So the life expectancy had almost caught up to the West in 1979, and then it freezes until about it not freezes, but it starts going up very incrementally. So things are getting worse
Mm-mm.
until about 1995.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this totally fucks with the Dengist, narrative about China, because they're like, oh, we had to do the super NEP and blah blah blah. I'm like, yeah, but uh, you actually have more gains but what they did during this time period is they privatized most education for rural children. They didn't
Smart.
provide for any funding for the education of women in the countryside, only urban women. And they privatized the hospitals, even though doctors were paid publicly, they had to get paid in currency. So in the rural thing, so like there's some public hospital, and this kind of stayed the status quo until like Hu Jintao sort of started to try to ameliorate this. Xi really has ameliorated this.
Mm.
So, and that's where the Gini coefficient bump that they've experienced in the last 10 years come from. It's like, because the way that they used to handle this was what I call the internal passport system. I forget the
Yeah, yeah,
Chinese
yeah.
word for it, but
I
is
never
to
knew.
just like keep the rural people in their province so that they didn't have development of a rampant proletariat in the cities. That was their answer. Xi's
Yeah,
answer
yeah.
is but
Make it fucking
he's
better.
right. So like I don't. When people tell me Xi is at the left of the Communist Party, I know a lot of people from the left of the Communist Party in China now. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, but I know about 5 who agree with that. However, I have a hard time believing that when I also see how popular he is with the right of
With
the
the right, yeah, yeah.
Communist Party, which I know no one wants to admit exists. So,
Mm.
and like he does say things periodically, like we're not going back to a non-marketized society anytime soon, or maybe ever, and stuff like that. And so I'm always like, so I'm like, for a state capitalist society, Xi is progressive. I actually believe that. Um, I also think he's engaging in a nation building consolidation project,
Yeah,
which means dealing with the West in harsh ways. I think genocide is too strong of a word, but it's not nice.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, um, and and I also think he is trying to assert regional autonomy, and occasionally piss off the U.S. Like flirting with building a base in the Solomon Islands, which I'm like, okay, I know you're trolling us right now, but um, and you can tell that particularly the United States, they don't like Russia. They don't. They think they can. They think that honestly, I have come to the conclusion, and I think they might be right about this. That now that Russia has gotten itself in the situation in Ukraine, that and even though its objectives are fairly limited, and that it's NATO, I agree with you that NATO encroachment is probably the dominant reason why I did it. I don't think it explains the timing,
No,
um,
no, no.
but I think ultimately that's what they're
There
concerned
was never a
about,
time.
right? It's just like I guess it's like, well, now's as good as any time.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry, go
but
on.
I think the U.S. Political calculus there, unfortunately, they never intended to let Ukraine into NATO. I don't believe, and they never intended to really let Ukraine into the EU. But I think now they're like, well, but now that Russia's taken the bait, we can bleed them.
Hmm.
Russia's overextended its power. We were afraid of them in the beginning. We can't crush them. It's too. We're not going to risk nuclear war, but we can make sure this conflict goes on.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I mean, and the
That
Ukrainians are going to
that's
come
what
out.
Liz Truss said. A warning. This is going to go on for 5 years. That's not a warning. That's what you want.
I mean, I think there's some people who've said that this could go on for a decade, and
Fuck.
I actually kind of think it's possible. Like, and you know what? You know what's gonna fucked up about that? You're gonna have a refugee crisis, and Poland's gonna be. It's gonna somehow become a major fucking European power. But
Oh,
also,
it's on the
yeah,
way.
yeah.
Absolutely.
But also, it's gonna be like the center of sex trafficking for the entire fucking West. Um,
With all these
because of all this,
mercenaries, with all their
because all this,
guns, policing it.
yeah.
Fuck.
Well, you have all these women. It's the same
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
that
of
happened at
course.
the 1992 in Russia. All right,
Fuck.
Ukrainian society is going to be ultra nationalist and completely broken, no matter how this ends. It's broken now. Like, like you don't recover for like. Think about Afghanistan. Everyone always thinks it's because because people are racist. They think it's because they're Muslim. I'm like, no. Societies that experience occupation like that, they don't recover in a fucking generation. Like
Yeah.
even if the occupation is not an intentional occupation, like I agree with you. I don't think Putin intends to occupy anything beyond the setting up an independent
He's,
state in the separatist territories, and they probably being de facto Russian satellite states. But like, I think that's the most of his ambition. That doesn't matter. You like
yeah.
by beelining towards Kiev,
Yeah.
it's not going to be like Georgia did, and Georgia's going to bounce back just with a tail between
Ah,
its
sure.
legs. But
The refugees will just head back. It'll be great.
it'd be great.
What?
So
Head back
nothing's
to
gonna
what?
happen. There's not gonna be any weird shit or internal contradictions in Ukraine itself that's gonna emerge from
Yeah.
this. Also, you haven't like been creating like Orthodox Christian ISIS or anything. I mean, like what the like
Yeah.
and by the way, I would also say like reactionaries have been flocking to both sides of this war. So it's like it's I was telling someone the other day, I'm like, I think from the realist geopolitical standpoint, which as a Marxist, I can't get onto the realist worldview, but I always say like the realists explain the way capitalist powers work
Oh
probably
yeah.
better than anybody else.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
There's like this realism and liberalism, and then there's Marxism, which obviously sees liberalism as a piece of shit, but realism is like is the difference between a Marxist and a realist is
what
Marxists just don't
side
like
they're
it.
on.
Yeah,
Right.
realists love it.
Right. Right. But but I think the description of like what was trying to be accomplished there is correct. What I don't think, um I think if the United States and Europe had not been running guns to Ukraine, I still think that perhaps this would be more of a clusterfuck than people realize, because I think about um, what more trained soldiers with better munitions fighting against even less technologically advanced people in Afghanistan do. Like,
Oh,
and
Derek, you're giving me a headache.
yeah, but I think you're right. I think that that warning is also like a prediction, and I know Russia's just trying to be like, "We'll nuke you, we swear." No, you won't, because you know if you nuke us, then it's world.
We were wrong
Yeah,
3 months ago.
fair enough, fair enough. But I'm not wrong about what happens if they nuke us. If they
Yeah,
nuke us,
yeah,
what
yeah.
happens to Russia? Most of us lose a third to half of our population. Most of Europe becomes semi-uninhabitable. Most U.S. major cities don't exist anymore. Every populated area in Russia is turned to ash.
Yeah. Yeah, it won't happen.
Because while they have more nuclear weapons, we have better ones, and so it's like, and China may intervene. I get into wild scenarios where you have like China going in and taking over the Russian government to stop a nuclear war from happening. You start talking about that kind of shit. Like anything's off the like. That's where you
Yeah,
act,
yeah, yeah.
which lets me indicate they don't really mean it. They mean that like, yeah, if you make us do it, we'll do it.
Mm.
Um, and by that, but I don't believe all this talk about Putin using tactical nukes. I believe he's just trying to remind you that, like, hey, if you're really going to threaten Russia's existence, we're willing to take out the world. You know,
Yeah.
it,
I'm no psychologist, but it always appeared to me that he always just wanted to be a player on the stage, and no one ever took him seriously. And he just sort of he internalized more and more, and this is the sort of fruit of his work, I guess. It's like, well, now I'm back, and now you're going to take me seriously, and I don't know
I
if they
mean,
will.
and and in a way, like, you don't post-Soviet Russia is a nation that is very right wing, that is very confined, that Putin is been very much a rational actor in. I mean, I will say that like this was the first time where I'm like, okay, like this is you finally made a misstep. Like that was my thought in the beginning. Like if now that you've made the West look like its intelligence agencies, which have constantly looked wrong for the past 20 years, was actually very right on something, that alone is but as I told people, I mean, like, the
He
ghouls
walked
are
into that for
winning.
sure.
The ghouls are winning.
Yeah, yeah, all over.
uh
I mean, they already were.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, what we have now is, for all of Zizek's problems, and there's a lot of them, but Zizek is right about one thing. um the left fucking up leads to a reactionary thing, because eventually the reaction to liberal conservatism is non-liberal conservatism.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
leftism. And the left is fucked up everywhere in the world majorly, partly by trying to, I think, my personal opinion is, it tried to jump to a political conclusion off of urgency about climate change before it actually did the groundwork
Hmm.
to build the things it needed to have both a mass base and electoral base.
Yeah, almost in every political issue, though, right?
Yeah,
Not
across the
just.
board,
Yeah.
across the board. And in fact, it also got used to use in the United States. Now, this is not so much true in Europe, but it also got used to using judicial fiat and then popular opinion to win the social and cultural
Mm,
debates,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it overstepped its hand. dramatically in that front. Um, because it didn't feel like it needed to bring quote average people along with it and
Yeah.
convince them anymore of their moral. They just thought they could assert it. And I do think this is where I almost sound like one of those fucking like centrist American liberals, where I'm like, social media really gave people bad habits on how you build broad coalitions. They think
Mm.
that just asserting your moral will because racism and anti-transgender stuff and turfism is wrong, that people will automatically agree with you. And I'm like, no, you look like you're bullying them.
Yeah.
And you understood this, like liberal activists understood this even 10 years before on stuff like gay marriage. Like the assumption after the gay marriage debate was won in the United States was that all this was automatic and given.
Mm.
And a lot of leftists respond to me saying this is like, look, I support trans rights. I'm not against you in this, but and I'm not telling you, unlike say the post leftist or the patriotic socialist or any of these nitwits, that you should be tailing the right. I'm telling you, however, you do have to convince people on cultural and moral issues where they don't have a lot at stake personally what the stakes are, because otherwise it looks pretty bad.
Yeah.
And you know,
I think
and
the discourse on tailing the right from the left, like I think it has to be remembered that a lot of the talking points that the alt right or the demagogue, the ideologues of that sort of tradition now, they their talking points weren't necessarily conservative. Their politics were, and they were attracting people through what they were talking about, their talking points to their politics. It wasn't like here is our
classical
politics.
state classical thing that I always point out. I'm like, okay, so the electoral base of fascism was the petty bourgeois and parts of the non-working poor. The mass base of fascism was the lumpen proletariat and semi-lumpenized elements out of the army. And but the intellectual core of fascism was Marxist defectors.
Yeah, of course.
Um, I do not. Now I am more hesitant than a lot of other people to call the kind of. I take Enzo's Traverso and calling a lot of the stuff post-fascism more than fascism. I don't think it's truly fascist. There's things that like there's not the mass base in this stuff is not really mass. While like uh, Dr. Clive Burrow was on my show yesterday and was talking about like, yeah, if you took all the militias in the United States, they'd be 60,000 strong. And I'm like, yeah, but and yes, they have military training, a lot of them, but like that's also smaller than the DSA.
1 million
Um,
people voted for the communists in France. When I saw
right,
that figure, I was like,
right,
"What?
right. It's
Move
like,
to Ireland?"
and yet also it didn't matter that much ultimately at all.
Mattered
And
nothing. Took
because
away from the left.
right, and actually, I've been pointing out to people we're our understanding of things from the 19th and early 20th century have made us lose fact of the totally different scale in which we're dealing with,
Yeah.
in population terms and this, that, and the other. And what I was also saying is like we needed to build things like alternatives to. Not only do we need to increase unionization in the United States, because like we can complain about trade union consciousness in Europe, but that would actually be a step up for us. Um, you know, as much as I think the whole American obsession with Europe is so left wing, I'm like, you're a fucking get fucked. But it does have more working class consciousness than we do. The other thing I would say is that we needed to not only build those institutions up, like currently existing unions, even though they're a problem. Actually, let's
Yeah,
say
but they're still necessary to work through,
right,
aren't they? Right?
yeah. But I also think we needed not to try to build a fucking para party and you know, because you needed a mass enough base, not 100,000 fucking people, mostly in
Yeah.
California, Portland, and New York. Um, you needed a mass enough base to truly scare not
Yeah.
Republicans but Democrats
Oh yeah,
that there
of
would be
course. Yeah.
consequences if they did that, and we never did that. And some of that are we have some legal, you know, prohibitions that put us in a particularly bad bind that even Europe's not in, like what our Taft Hartley stuff. But And while we're seeing, like I point out, like, yeah, we're seeing new unions in America all the time, and that's growing, that's great. But you know what? I know you're not talking about this, I know you don't want to talk about this, but unionization actually has accelerated its decline since COVID started. The
Whoa.
currently existing unions are hemorrhaging members because they don't do shit.
Huh.
Um, and COVID proved it. Like, so
The extreme hypothetical of Biden and Corbyn ever actually getting in with their milk toast policies, um, even at that, like in terms of the sort of direction that society, economy, and everything was going in, the the U-turn of the politics there would, the amount of sort of social elbow room and credit,
yeah,
like would have to be carried by a very committed large base. Like
yeah,
people would have to realize the sacrifice they were going to make for this reorientation, and if that base didn't get exist, and either of those politicians came to power, they would get crucified far more than
right.
they were.
Right, exactly. And this is my whole thing. Like that mass base,
Everyone would buy into that crucifixion because
but
they'd feel
also
the
that
pain.
that mass base has to be like you have to actually be able to deliver something, and that's what the American leftists and even the American liberals don't understand. Like who people vote against their self interest. No, they don't. Like
Yeah,
they don't. They don't vote against their self interest. You don't pass this shit, even when you're in power. So don't say it's against people's self interest because there's always two or three fucking dipshits in the Senate or whatever that keeps you from doing a goddamn thing. Right. And it's hard not to believe that you don't know that. Right. That like you want to talk about false consciousness. Like you have to know that. Like,
yeah.
all the talk of climate change out of the Biden administration, the whole climate change initiative is less than what Elon Musk spit on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like
The actual
little
value
fun
of
little
money.
factoid. Like so, like don't give me this shit about.
But what if Bernie runs again?
Well, here's the thing, and I was actually saying this about. I mean, the Trump base believes in him more than the Bernie base believes in him now. But
Yep.
I will say also though, and against that, none of them have the credibility as an anti-establishment, anti-political figure anymore. Like Bernie was already losing it before 2020,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think now, particularly after everybody trying to say, oh, he'll use his precedence on the financial committee to like secretly do socialism through reconciliation. And I just remember just being like, you're on crack. Then there was all this positive talk and attempts out of the Biden administration in the first month. And even I was like, okay, maybe it won't be as bad as I thought. And then like 2 months after that, I'm like, no, it's worse than I thought. Like, they're not going to do shit. He's not even going to do the things that he can. As a last ditch effort, he might forgive up to $150,000 student loans. Now, that for my European listeners, I need to understand that the average student loan debt is probably about 10K, but that's because most people don't finish school. If you finish school, your student loan debt's between 30 and 60K minimum. Um,
Jesus Christ.
and by the way, even the subsidized loan rates have been between 7 and 8%. But we're talking about things that are before the current housing inflation, that were nearly mortgage-sized commitments. Uh, and then all the reactionary response to that is like, well, it'll just help the rich. And you're even hearing this from some Democrats, like, oh, but only 10K would help black people more. I'm like, you guys are fucking morons. But it does seem like Biden is willing to say, okay, I'm willing to maybe forgive by fiat, which I can legally do, probably, up to 50K. And the Republicans are scared of that. Now, that'll only temporarily fix the program because we're not killing the student loan program. We're not fixing colleges. So that's a very small fix. But that may save some of the slaughtering that's going to come. I just don't think it's going to be enough. But they haven't done anything else they've really said they were going to do. Even like their child tax credit, which they supposedly really cared about, they let drop. Like,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
so there's no mass base that they're afraid of. There isn't. They're not afraid. They're afraid of their donors. They're not afraid of us. And we've proven it. The DSA has proven it too. They won't really stand up to them. Like I'm like, I don't know. Like, back in the old days, even the social democrats, if you broke the program, they might have jumped you after, like, on the street. Like they may have even bad things may have happened to you. Like
Yeah. Socialists used to have guns.
yeah. I mean, well, we still do here. Oh,
I meant you guys. I meant in terms of being popular.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we always have. We just whenever you say have guns, I'm like, well, we of course we have guns. Like we have more guns than probably food. Like,
Just pretend not to like it.
oh man,
It should be a matter of pride.
It's funny because American socialists are so torn on that one question because
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, yeah.
It's like because half of them are like we need gun control. I'm like, well, sorta, but and I no, I don't think with our pea shooters, even if they're AR-15s, are we going to take out the federal government. But I don't know. I don't really want to live in a society where black market right wing, AK-47 havers have an advantage over me.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
and I say this as a person who doesn't own a gun anymore, but I used to, and I know how to use it. And the one thing I tell everybody is like, get medic trained first, learn how to do first aid, and then learn how to shoot a gun, and then hopefully never have to do it, and only own one if you need it. But
I think I remember hearing you say that before, and I was like, I don't have to listen to that. And I'm now kind of thinking, oh, fuck. I better actually look into that.
Europeans are like, wait, guns? Like, I'm like, yes, guns. You may need them.
Switzerland will defend us.
Oh yeah. Well, my favorite thing about the American right is they love Sweden and Switzerland, and they also hate Sweden and Switzerland like simultaneously, and it's so fucking weird. Like they're like those commies in Sweden. Also, we like their weird school program, and we like that Switzerland has guns. And I'm like, y'all are strange. Y'all are just bizarre. We like that Sweden did weird shit during COVID.
Yeah, why can't we have that? Because of the fucking communists and governments. Yeah. Fucking Biden.
Yeah, every time I hear, my favorite is like they're blaming communists for Disney now, and I'm just like,
yeah.
I wish my dear reactionaries that we had the power to be half as progressive as fucking finance capital at this point.
Yeah,
but
like you guys are gone just psychedelic. Like the way the political compass is just eating itself and shitting itself back out again and eating itself.
Everybody's calling everybody else commies now, and on both sides, it's fucking bizarre. It's just like everybody's a Russian agent. You just think like all the pent up neuropathy, like neuropsychosis of baby boomers and older Gen Xers just got unleashed upon the world. It's just like
that was one big thing was like once the sort of older generations caught onto the social media and they didn't really fully get it, and they just started like projecting. I was like, whoa, this is dark. The internet's gotten really dark.
That was the thing, because I'm like, the internet, I mean, I remember the wild days of the internet, but like, and those wild days are over. But when I was like, oh my god, I've been complaining about how the youth was stupid, but and they are, but you give Facebook to boomers and they become morons overnight.
It's scary.
Like people that I used to kind of respect, even I'd be like, you believe that? You like I mean, the QAnon phenomenon blew my mind. It really did. Where I was like, okay, that can't be nearly that. Oh my god, it's like 10% of the U.S. population.
What?
But that's a joke. No, it's not. But the thing is though, it has such a low bar for being considered because a bunch of people believe like one QAnon conspiracy.
Yeah, okay.
And there's probably like 0.5% people who are like diehard Qers.
Yeah.
But it's no one really knows how big they really are. like because they're not a
Okay.
formal organization.
Mhm.
Um,
So sort of like all the conspiracies that like the left would have been into as well are just lumped in.
yeah, well, yeah, and unfortunately,
12 days.
I have been. I am notorious. I know I shit on everybody. I've lost more patron support for what I say about this. Left conspiracy culture will lead us to the right, um, because I've seen it do it before. Uh, I saw what happened with Truthorism. Truthorism was not originally I mean, yes, Alex Jones was part of it, but it was originally a mostly left wing movement
What?
and in the United States.
Wow.
Uh, and that it went right wing within 3 or 4 years. Like
3 or 4 years, not months. Holy shit.
years. I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, because a lot of it was driven by hatred of George Bush, and at the
Yeah, yeah, of
time,
course.
most of that was left wing, and then there were these weirdos like Alex Jones who were so right wing they hated
But that's
neoconservatives.
that's what I was sort of alluding at a minute ago. It's like there was that sort of a safe level of conspiracy theory back then. Is it so much that I mean, I don't think the left's version of it or early days was the same sort of ramped up psycho shit that it became. Right?
No, 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 no. It was
There's a quality difference.
it's a quality difference. But the thing is, once you start accepting one or two of those things, it is
It
easier
just
easier.
yeah, okay.
And I see it again, like leftists getting into like JFK conspiracies that he was a secret communist, and I'm like, he may have wanted to
Oh
end the
yeah.
Vietnam War for tactical reasons. Like I believe that, but I don't know it. We don't have any evidence for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but
That's
but
the
yeah,
necessary take really is a healthy skepticism, but the fact that we're so unlikely to know anything,
right. And
stay away from it.
conspiracies are real. There are real conspiracies. But I tend to think if there's over 50 people in them, you're gonna know about them in a year.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
like
Although I wonder nowadays, is that still true? Is there sort of is there like an increase in capacity to keep a lid on something? Just a
I
thought.
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder. Maybe it's an increase in capacity of it mattering if you keep a lid on
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Good point. Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah. That's probably a thing.
there's so much bullshit out there, and we're so skeptical about stuff that would probably like, for example, I'll give you an example. Uh, there's probably something to the Hunter Biden stuff here. I mean, honestly, there really kind of is. It took forever to the New York Times report on it. Now, conspiracy theorists have been using it to sneak all kinds of crazy shit into what's in that. Um, but the unfortunately, because the left is so inured to like ever taking anything seriously that makes its side look bad, our liberals look bad, really. Um, that we often like, well, we'll accept the Still dossier, but we won't take Hunter Biden's thing seriously until like a year after Biden's in office. And then I'm like, and that's a tactical mistake
Yeah,
because people have been attaching bullshit to this, and you validated a link in the chain by not taking it seriously in the beginning. Similar with the Clinton emails, which were not unserious, etc. And unfortunately, even some quasi leftist figures will cower at being cut out of liberal society when they stand up to it. Like I've seen Doug
right.
Henwood
Okay. Yeah.
really back down on a lot of stuff he said about Hillary Clinton because of the shit he got after that during the Trump years, and so now he's like a good
Yeah.
soldier, you know. So
It's like we need a revolution or something.
yeah, yeah, and to bring it back to our initial point, the MMTers, my friends, they're not going to get what they want. To kind of wrap this up and to wrap it down to what I was initially going to talk to you about, though, uh, the MMT problem that we were talking about is based on imperialism and its positive social policy, the stuff that we would be in agreement with them on, like work guarantee. Marxists have always said we should never propose that as a policy solution because we know it will not happen. Right? Like it is not a viable solution for capitalists as long as there are capitalists. They will never allow 100% employment.
Yeah, yeah, for
Like
sure.
Like,
I mean, like, is sorry, because I've obviously missed this. Is that a serious consideration? Is that a serious sort of policy? Like, we can get this passed at some stage if we
they
push hard
claim
enough.
that, which I think is they claim that we can have a federal jobs guarantee.
And your point is, if we ever got that far, then we'd have enough power to fucking go far further than MMT anyway.
Right, exactly. Like, and yeah, but maybe there's some insights from MMT that we can include when we're building our labor token schemes or whatever. But like, it's not to say it's useless. I actually don't think that. I actually sadly think Marxists have ceded most of the innovation in heterodox economics thought on currency to modern monetary theory because we've been stuck trying to pretend that we were still operating on fucking gold. like like and stuff like that. So
That's
are
what
we
the
just
book says.
yeah. That's what one of the books says, even though
One of the
another of
books.
books makes fun of that, but whatever. Um,
When you halfway
but
through the
yeah,
other one.
yeah. Well, the thing about Marxists is Marxists are really, really bad at reading Marx because when they read Marx, they realize that Marxist
Falsely.
thought actually developed over time, and not even in this clean, like Althusserian way. There's like a simple, like,
He he just got better at it.
yeah, epistemic split. No, he got better at it. He did more stuff. He saw more of the world.
Yeah.
He drew out the logic of what he was seeing more and more and more throughout his life. I tend to take late Marx. A lot of people love early Marx. I like early Marx, but I tend to take late Marx, and by late Marx, I mean the stuff where he's like no longer writing for the public, like all his letters that he's writing when he's in the First International and stuff. That's the stuff that I think is gold because it actually explains a whole lot of shit that that from like the official stuff, like the manifesto or even Capital, at least unless you include theories of surplus value in there, um, you're just like, okay, like, if your idea of what Marxism was is what they had in the First International from the people who didn't know Marx, so
Mhm.
like or Engels, because at least Kautsky had like a direct line to Engels. Um, you're gonna think that Marxism consists of the early manuscripts, the early Hegelian manuscripts, Das Kapital and the Manifesto, and Critique of the Growth Program was available to the public by this point, and then Kautsky's writings. That's all you got.
That's mad.
Like you think about the codification of orthodox Marxism, that's what most people are working with outside of the people who corresponded with Marx directly.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like,
my kickstart back into all this was, I think I might have mentioned before, Lachlan and Moof, and their sort of intro was recounting orthodox and revisionism, and it just so quickly was just like, fucking why is this the argument? Like, read the fucker. Just read him. And like, the more I'm reading, the more how shocking the distance between what you're describing and the actual work. Like,
yeah,
it's
I
huge.
mean, it's and
Far more
then
exciting as well.
I mean it's also interesting. Like I'm having a little bit of trouble because another fucking Brit.
I'm not
I
a
know
Brit.
you're I know you're Irish. I know you're Irish, but you're in a British time zone. Um,
Okay.
Another Islander.
Well,
Uh, um, I actually think it's funny. We never refer to the Brits and the Irish as Islanders, but they actually are.
I
Anyway,
know, yeah, it's weird.
um, um, uh, but anyway, um,
Germans do, I think.
oh well,
At least in their attitude. We're
that
little islanders for sure.
I mean,
We're little ideas.
um, oh well,
Sorry, go
yeah.
on.
I mean, even Marx and Engels talk about like Anglo brain rot. Like it's and they actually I think they attribute it to the islands. Like,
Yeah, they're soggy fucking islands.
yeah, it's funny because I'm like Marx and Engels were surprisingly racially progressive in a lot of ways, and there's other ways where they're like,
They dug in, didn't they?
yeah, they're like, the Slavs aren't a world historic people. We're not even sure the British are a world historic people. It's just like, so it's funny in that way. But anyway, the guy who runs Marxism Translated, I'm trying to get him on. I'm going to get him on probably next
Cool.
month, and because I was like, why the fuck am I having trouble in English, even with the access to English and British resources? I can't find key documents of the Second International in English because no one's fucking translated them. That's basic bitch shit. And German's not hard. It's not like we're like, I can find 9th century poems in Urdu easier than true facts, easier than I can find fucking English translations of key Second International documents. Why
Does
is that?
is there anyone paying that's for that sort of shit?
Well, we're Patreon funding it. That like I contribute. Part of my Patreon actually goes to the Patreon of Marxism Translated because like there's just like 3 guys in Germany and Britain just translating this German shit away, so we have it. And yeah,
I've
a
got
lot
a
of it's boring, but a lot of it's important.
yeah,
Like
of course. I've got a translator in my capital reading group. That's German English. If you know if there's any jobs going, I'll
yeah,
let
I
them
mean,
know.
oh man, even getting like when I started reading because I'm not proficient at German anymore, but I can read it. And I started dealing with like different translations and then translation like so I have like 5 copies of the manifesto around here. And I was like, okay, so opening up the 3 or 4 English, most of them are Victorian for one thing. And then not that's not necessarily bad, but and then I'm like going through and I'm like, okay, this and this read differently. Let me go back to the original German and pick through it. Oh shit, this is poorly translated. Like, like, oh man. Or
Oh,
and sometimes in Marx, it's like in Hegel, the subtle distinction in the German's actually really fucking important. And
mm.
it's like, and we don't get it. We just don't get it. It's like not in our. uh
Are we wasting our time?
yeah, it's. I mean, I am excited. I'm not excited about all the people doing the Mega 2 research, but I am excited about the Mega 2 research because uh, we need more of an understanding of stuff like because there's all these weird categories in Marx that are kind of underexplained that he was thinking about and working out, but that don't make it to the main text. They didn't make it into text print in his lifetime, um, and some of them are even though Capital Volume 2 is not fun to read, it's like Capital Volume 1 is cleaned. You can tell Marx cleaned that shit up, even though he's like, it's for the workers. You have untranslated Greek and Latin in there, Marx. That's not for the workers. Even I don't believe that. Like,
Isn't there half a chapter where Engels is just like Marx was just talking aloud to himself here? Disregard
right.
this chapter.
Yeah. I also went through the Fred Mosley comparison of the pre-Ingalls edited economic manuscripts and the post-Ingalls edited economic manuscripts, and they're not that different, except when Ingalls takes out like math equations that he thinks doesn't make sense.
He says that's it. That's it. Yeah, yeah. He wasn't very
like,
good at maths. So
well,
he just confused himself.
what was interesting, this is something I take from the econophysicist people that I think is serious. Like Marx seemed to realize he needed something like modern statistics, and what he was working with was kind of accounting math. And his
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
accounting math logic is actually quite sound and explains a lot of the actual economy. But when you start dealing with stuff like what is value if it's not actual price, but it's price, it's
Yeah.
like an abstraction from price and aggregate. Well, you can figure that out. That's when I always say like value is, value properly speaking is the the amount that you can get from general exploitation, the way Marx explained it, and it shows up as an attractor to price.
Mm.
So if you take all the prices on
Mhm.
in the economy on and then average them out, it won't reach what the calculation for value is, but it'll be close.
Yeah.
Um, but any given price is not going to follow that because people can charge whatever the fuck they can get away with. It's just
Yeah.
they can Marx's logic is you can't get away with put a certain amount of charging for a certain amount of labor, um, which more or less works out to be true in my opinion if you use statistics to prove it.
Yeah. Okay.
Marx didn't have all those statistical maths, And so he's realizing he needs some maths that are not fully worked out, but he in no way is capable of doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
So like that's an interesting element. I mean, like particularly in the mathematical manuscripts where he's like trying to invent something like calculus, but it's mostly nonsense. Like it's just, it's just like.
Is there any work on that already?
Uh,
I mean,
I,
like,
I think Fred Mosley has done some of that because Fred Mosley talks about one of the equations that Ingalls does take out actually ends up being important. It's like the value time equation. Um, but there's that. I mean, there's also like the other controversy marks where I'm sympathetic to both sides is the in volume 3 where he states the tendency of the rate of profits to fall. His explanation for it is shitty, and I agree it's shitty. But the problem is, and I pointed this out to people, one, and at least when we're dealing with real commodities, even standard economists agree that it's true. I mean, neoclassical, not classical. All
yeah.
classical economists, all the way back to fucking Ibn Khaldun. I was reading Ibn Khaldun the other day. If I can find the book, the 13th century like
I
proto
have not heard of them.
sociologist. Yeah, he's a guy who comes up with the theories of sociology and history that like predates Marxism that is similar to it. It's but anyway, he even notices like he talks about the theory of prices to drop and profits to decline when you're dealing in gold and silver. Like that's in the 13th century. Like that's arguably pre-capital.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they're
yeah.
already seeing this. Like so it's just weird. I get so on one hand, I agree on the philological statement that like Marx didn't really work this out. On the other hand, these people often extrapolate from that there is no declining rate of profits, and I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah. It's just
that's absurd. Like to me, that's like the one. I'm like, look, GDP doesn't measure much, but it does measure like some form of aggregate profitability. And my friends, it always goes down. Like she's
yeah,
like,
yeah. What's the argument against it? Like, well, what's it
a
based
lot of
on?
the arguments are just like, well, people are getting richer and richer, and I'm like, but that's not what we mean by profits,
But the
right?
wealth is
Like,
concentrating in that situation, isn't it?
right, and you would expect it to concentrate on low profitability conditions because people would
Yeah,
hoard it as opposed to invest it. Like,
exactly. The what's the incentive to risk for profits if you're getting rates on rent?
right, and so
Weird.
what the incentive is to invest it into basically rent markets, and what we increasingly see in anything that's like that they can do this. So in non-tangible commodities, you're increasingly seeing everything go to a rent model. You don't
Yeah.
buy video games anymore. You rent
Yeah,
them.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's
Like,
you're not going to own anything, and you're going to be happy about it. It's well, I mean, every boom and bust cycle is like a capture of the labor market, and then an ejection of the labor market in smaller and smaller situation. And there's a desperate struggle to become independent from the proletariat. I feel. And I think that's the capitalist process. And every time that happens, like the financial section of the pie is that bit bigger than it was relative to the productive industrial element. And you get to a point eventually where, like you just described, that the money's hoarded. They're sustaining their control over the material resources through rents, and you couple that with AI, and you've just got a sort of an increasingly defunct, not only increasingly defunct labor
but
pool.
you have an increasingly invisible bourgeoisie too. This
Yes,
is what Clive Burrow was talking about. Starting with the crisis in the 1930s, you started seeing the revolts of the unproductive classes versus both the productive classes, both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and from the unproductive parts of the bourgeoisie, the finance capitalist. And I'm sorry, it seems to me that after 1970, the finance capitalist fucking won.
yeah, for sure.
Like, you
I didn't
know,
even think this was a controversy.
no, I think like, well, it's like the people like this you'll see in Keynesian and some. I'm not going to tar our imitators with this, but some imitators who will just say that like, well, everything that happened in the 70s was a policy choice, and I'm like, It was a policy choice to have negative profitability for 3 years that like no one denies. Like, what are you on? Like,
Hmm.
like that was just because of endogenous, an exogenous shock in oil, and I'm like,
Hmm.
exogenous shocks always eventually happen, and if you have a fragile system with declining gains, it will put it negative.
Yeah,
I don't see how that's an answer to
that's a
what I'm
choice.
saying. Yeah, like, and how you can policy get out of that. Oh, we can just policy make alternative energy work at a scale of fossil fuel just overnight. We can policy retrain 55-year-old ex miners to be coders in 2 weeks. Come the fuck on, like, I used to do that actually. One of my first jobs was I taught night school. I was also a public school teacher at the time, but I taught night school at a college where all the factories have been shut down and people were trying to go to school to like get into computers or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever, and I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah.
they're fucking doomed. Like, no one's going to hire them because they're like 55. Like, and I'd be like, oh well, maybe we can get you into some other skilled field, or I can get you something, but
Yeah, well, this is the
coding,
policy in that document over here as well. It's like
yeah,
just this constant scale and market that
we're
like
just dumping people into the abyss with that shit.
yeah, yeah.
Like,
The the if you want a cutting edge state of the art transport system in the country, you go to a country that has that, and you just do that
yeah,
in your place. You don't skillify. The entire skill thing is just a way to take public money, flush it through the economy, and privatize it,
yeah, it's exactly what it is.
which increases this
Which,
this
by the way,
financial
yeah,
leverage.
but this financial thing, I've pointed out to people about, well, neoliberalism is like ordoliberalism. I'm like, no, it's not. One of the things I'll tell you is in ordoliberalism, you did not see businesses develop massive fucking bureaucratic apparatuses, uh,
Ordo
and
liberals
encourage
wanted to give us the wanted to give us the means of production.
right, like
I'm still waiting.
like but I just point this out to people. I'm like,
It's yeah, it's
neoliberals
bananas.
neoliberals say they're all about efficiency, but and like we have cost disease and everything now,
Yeah.
from admin bloat and rent seeking, like, and that's across the entire economy. Like,
The entire intellectual project like inspired by they could have read Lenin's imperialism and said, "Oh shit, this is bad. We need to save capitalism from what he's describing." And once those policies really come into force, you start seeing that tendency to financialize again, which is fucking bananas. But it's not what I wouldn't say that's what neoliberals like ideologically wanted or aspired
no,
to whatsoever.
they I don't think they explained it. They expected a broad administrative class. In fact, I think they thought they were going to get rid of it. But my point is, like, bureaucracy under them got worse in
Mm.
every way and every place. It was relatively contained actually during the welfare state period. Yes, there was a lot of it compared to like the 18th century, but still, like, you look at say the United States in the 30s versus the United States in the 90s and 1980s. We don't have less, to use a David Graeber term that I think is both insightful and bullshit at the same time. Bullshit jobs. Like,
Yeah,
they're like, I just point out to people that, like, that's not a conspiracy just of one class to will itself into existence. There's reasons why those are happening, but they're not good. They're not efficient. And but then again, like, I point out to people, what happens in the United States if you get socialized medicine? Well, there's a whole thing of middle class jobs that you just got rid of. What are you going to do with those people?
mm,
So it's not like if we'd have done it in the 50s before all this shit had started.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like, for example, if the NHS had waited to the 1990s, it wouldn't have happened. Like in the UK,
Hmm.
and I think that is not understood well enough. Again, and not to shit on MMTers, but again, they don't all believe this. But sometimes when you talk to them, they seem to think this is all just policy, and I'm like, systems and material conditions. And by material conditions, I mean a lot of things. I mean environment, I mean productive capacity, I mean relations of production, I mean legal stuff, actually, because that has material effects, even if it's theoretically
But
superstructural, whatever.
this is the sort of the point I was making. It's like if you're sort of reading that intellectual project of neoliberalism, the outcomes from it are like
But
totally
I mean, like,
the
actually,
opposite.
the outcomes is like, oh, so we still got all the shit you were complaining about in Soviet communism anyway, and we got none of the benefits.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Where's the boat
like,
rails of the 20th century?
yeah, my God. I mean,
What
it
did
is
Fisher
sort of,
say? Stalin, market Stalinism.
yeah, yeah. You know, Fisher. That's this is another rant. Um, Fisher, Fisher's a character that I thought was both incredibly insightful and I can say this now that he's really, really dead. I didn't feel like I could say. I felt like I could say it when he was alive because I've said it to his face. Well, not to his face, to his email. We've had many exchanges, and then I feel like I could say it now that some of the sheens worn off of the tragedy of his death. But he is one of the most insightful popularizers of Marxist theory, and also in some ways, though, he like couldn't correlate all the things he was saying because there were times when he was like, capitalist realism just makes you think another world isn't possible. But I'm like, under these conditions, Mark, another world isn't possible.
Mm.
We can change the conditions, sure, but it's a lot more than what you're asking for. It is not us
Yeah,
being
yeah,
nice
yeah,
to Russell Brand or having Jeremy Corbyn.
yeah.
Like, that is not what we're talking about, and that's not what you should be talking about. And
Yeah, those. I mean, those days are increasingly passing, aren't they? The the idea that we can. I mean, I feel that it starts with Lachlan move with social strategy, the radical reformism, and
I think unfortunately a lot of people are not going to give it up, but they're going to tell the
uh,
right. They're going to tail part of the right, the Nash, and this something is something that you Islanders have a better experience with because you do have a national conservative red Tory tradition. The United States does not.
mm,
Ours is new. Like we our homegrown fascist movements never looked like that. Um, and you know, nominally, even a lot of them would even have claimed to be left wing, like Huey Long and whatnot. But something like the National Conservatives, somebody trying to pick up, corporatist, integralist, distributist talking points, talking about like we have to help the working class but integrate them into the larger social structure and you know and unfortunately, the American left is so emaciated, and like the movement of the Overton window was so shallow that they don't understand that that is the opposite of our project, even if it looks superficially to help workers.
yeah,
And
yeah,
to me, this is like, oh, now we have something that I don't think it is anything like European fascism. Well, it is like European fascism. It's not European fascism, but it's coming out of that world in a way that our politics, aside from our racial politics in the Southeast, never really had. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's going to be interesting because a lot of people seem to think they can tell that and manipulate that in a left wing way. And my response has always been people are going to go, if like if you're going to act like a rightist, I'm just going to vote for a rightist. Like, I mean, I mean, I've even put on the table, like, hell, as much as the Republicans claim to oppose loan forgiveness now, I could totally see them doing something like, yeah, we'll forgive all the student loans, fine. We're also ending all federal subsidies to all post secondary education. Have a nice day.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Of
Like,
course.
like that. But it might even initially be popular because even people in academia look at all the bloat that we've been talking about since neoliberalism and go, well, that has to die. Like, that's
Yeah.
insane. Um,
It's like again, every single thing just needs an entirely different base or
yeah.
something. an
perhaps,
entirely different context.
yeah, perhaps revolution requires more than just insurrection, my friend. Perhaps it requires, I don't know, recontextualizing the world from the ground up, which has when people like, oh, you can't. I'm like, you totally can do that. It's been done before. Capitalism was that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Like,
If they had the revolution, why are we so meek about ours?
but to be fair, their revolution probably took 400 years.
Oh,
But
that's revolution at the same time.
right, but they did have. I mean, I do sometimes think the Marxists get really tied to the political revolutions. I'm like, yeah, but it was kind of like a 400-year political process that.
Yeah, yeah. A minute ago when I said about the those days are gone, about the sort of the reformism, I meant in the authorship, and
Oh
maybe I
yeah,
still being a bit optimistic. But the one of the, I think it was Olin Wright, the way he described the development, the way you just described it, of capitalism, and to put that in perspective for a social revolution, like, yeah, 100 years, 200 years, we'll be looking back on what was happening in China from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, as these like historic experiments that sort of eventually accumulated to an aggregate of something different. Yeah, I mean, there you've got those, you've got 1917, but um, you've got that slow accumulation over
yeah.
time.
I totally agree with you, and I am. I'm beginning. I'm going to be interviewing her next week, Dr. Rebecca Carl. About She always talks about we should think about China as like contemporary China, going back to the Boxer Rebellion on through the various revolutions under Mao, as like a series of experimental revolutions, and a bunch of them, like not just like two or three,
Mm.
like five or six or seven is how you should be thinking about this. Like the and I think about that in you go back and looking at why it's so hard, for example, to figure out when the medieval world, whether you want to call it feudal or manorial, emerged from the antique world. Well, you don't have revolutions. You have different levels of decay and falling apart, and
Yeah, yeah.
this, that, and the other. Um, and basically for me, feudalism are the incoherence of feudalism, because feudalism to me is like kind of like the USSR. It's not really a coherent mode of production. Um, is because you have society stuck in a stasis between the kind of, which, saying it's a slave society is too simple, but the
Mm.
kinds of societies that you see in these antique empires and nascent merchant capitalism
Mm.
that almost developed at the end of the Roman Empire. And some people like Banerjee will say like capitalism starts at like the end of the Roman. I don't really believe that, but you do see the beginnings of it, and then it falls apart, and then you have like, what we call colloquially feudalism, and then you also have like a 400 year period where like stuff like capitalism kind of bubbles up, doesn't
Yeah,
quite get there, kind of bubbles up again, goes further, doesn't quite get there, until it kind of happens in the Italian city states, and then really happens in England.
yeah, yeah.
um
Oh,
and
yeah, like, not I mean, not just, in a couple 100 years, as I was saying, not just looking back on China, but looking back on Cuba, looking back on, what's his face? Robert Owen, looking back on the
mm,
entire thing, like, experiments failed,
yeah.
successful, but, like, you don't we have an awful fetish to judge them now, but, like, a a capitalist might have done that, but they would have been incorrect to do that until 17th, 16th, 17th century,
I mean, and really until 1920, when it almost like it was. I mean, because the one thing I will say, like the true in Europe, the true completion of like getting rid of the aristocratic order,
Yeah.
and everywhere but England, is um, is you don't I don't I've come to the conclusion you don't want to be one of the first revolutions, because you're going to be like the least complete. um uh
Yeah.
so just want to put, but it really, I mean, it takes World War I and World War II to really finally
Mm.
get the ancien regime gone, like, they're fully
In terms of
incorporated into the
influence.
bourgeoisie, are just completely removed altogether. um and so I agree with you, like you don't see it until, you know 1780, 1790, and you don't really see it completely until 1920. But at that point, capitalism is beginning to get weak and start to decay. So, like,
Yeah.
I'm hoping socialism has a better track record.
Yeah, exactly. Or I mean, it even gets better after that.
Yeah, one would hope. Well, thank you for coming on, and
Thanks for
we'll
having
do
me
this
again.
again. And have a good day. It's kind of late there,
I'm
and
going to bed.
all right, get some sleep.
Good night. Good luck.
Good luck.